Hi everyone, I'm Dhilshan. I coach Gateway College Dhilshan, and I'll be doing a motions debrief on the round 5 motion of the APIIT Inter-School Debating Championship 2025. The motion reads, this House believes that major trading partners of the US, for example the UK, EU, China, Japan, Canada, should refuse to negotiate with the US to avoid the imposition of tariffs by the US. So I just want to talk about context first, and this applies for both teams. One is that maybe talk about how the fact that recently the Trump administration has imposed tariffs on a bunch of different countries. This ranged from major trading partners to even small ones and minor trading partners like Sri Lanka. The US has often used tariffs and the threat of tariffs as leverage in negotiations. This looks like the Trump's trade war with China, the NAFTA renegotiations with the USMCA, etc., etc. So the second thing you have to know when you're going into this motion is what this debate is about. So this motion is whether we think it's generally a good thing or a bad thing, whether or not major trading partners take a stance together and say that they refuse to negotiate under such corrupt and unfair circumstances, or whether it's better if they go to the negotiation table and have those discussions and try to reduce the tariffs through that way. The third thing is sort of understanding what these major trading partners look like and what they will do in this debate. So if they negotiate, in opposition's world, they may get a better deal, but this is under the threat and unequal terms. The terms are unlikely to favor them, and in most instances, it's going to worsen like the power that the US has. But if they do refuse to negotiate in proposition's world, they will stand up to bullying, but at the risk of losing access to the US market, and this might have short-term and long-term implications. What this also means is there's going to be a very obvious clash about the long-term push on proposition versus the short-term push on opposition. And this is something you need to keep in mind when you're going into the prep room and making your arguments as well. But the fifth thing is that, and this is very important, is that this debate is not an act of motion. So the only consideration isn't whether this is good or bad for the major trading partners. It can also take into consideration the implications to smaller trading partners, the global economic paradigm, or even what's good for the US as well. A disclaimer here though, this motion was set on the 27th of July, 2025. A lot of developments have happened since then, but I won't be taking those into consideration given that the motion was taking place before those things. So we'll start off by talking about proposition and then we'll go into opposition. So on prop setup, one thing I think you need to set up is that this motion gives proposition the fiat to assume that all major trading partners will refuse to negotiate together. So if op runs any lines, like how realistically only China will refuse and Canada will always negotiate, so bargaining power is weak, or that Canada will pull out at some time and then negotiate as well, this doesn't work because this is a should motion. It's about what X actor should do and the implications of that action. It's not what they would likely do in this debate. So you can assert that, all trading partners together will likely refuse to negotiate. No one's going to squirrel out at one moment. The second thing is, what does refusing to negotiate look like? I think this can look like a bunch of things. One is the declining of all Trump's invites to discuss until tariffs are removed. Two is like the imposition of counter tariffs on US goods under the condition that they'll be taken away if they remove the tariffs from you. Or it's also not agreeing to other economic demands during the period of which these tariffs are in place, etc. So I think there are 4 broad ideas you can run on proposition. One is why is this likely to work? And you need to prove likelihood here that even when you try to refuse to negotiate, you're likely to convince the US to take away some of the tariffs. I think you can prove this in 4 ways, but this is a non-exhaustive list. One is prove that a collective stand is more powerful in the US, that the EU, the Canada, several Asian superpowers all combined has a much strongest trading bloc than the US. And this proves capacity to some extent that if they all go against the US is likely to concede and listen. The second thing is that these tariffs also impact the United States. That when tariffs are in place, it's more expensive to import items, and sellers often shift this burden to consumers by increasing prices, which means that the goods for American citizens are also going to be significantly more expensive. So most people probably won't like this. The middle class, even the rich, the poor, will probably all get exhausted of this and will likely want to protest against the government and put pressure on them in order to reduce these tariffs because they want to be able to buy stuff for cheap prices. The third thing is that Trump's political opponents will likely weaponize these things as well. This looks like increasing pressure on Trump. Also explain why this will be effective pressure, that economic issues impact all extremes of the political spectrum. It doesn't matter whether or not you're left or right, and it's not very strong ideologically driven. So regardless what happens, you care about your life the most, and therefore if your life is affected economically and it's getting harder financially, regardless who you support, you're probably going to get very mad and you're probably going to go against Trump. The fourth thing is that there are a lot of multilateral treaties that are on your side, the WTO, for example, so it's easy to collectivize and it's also legitimate action to use. So using this, you can prove to some extent that the attempt to renegotiate by literally not negotiating, by declining the offer to negotiate, is going to be effective to some extent and is going to get the tariffs removed a bit as well. The second thing I think you need to prove on proposition is why negotiating is a terrible alternative. To say that the US strategy to create terrible conditions, force you into these conditions, and then make you agree is a form of blackmail. And if you agree that the demands will only increase, this creates a worse perpetual cycle where the US can just ask for more and more things. And now prove as to why the negotiations are bad. One is that the issues will like resurface at another point in time, but through other demands. So even if they take apart like tariffs right now, they might impose tariffs again in the future, but with different demands because they've known that it's worked in the past. But the second thing is that the results of these negotiations are a permanent loss to your trading partners. Therefore, if you sign these contracts, it's tough to go back. It's a permanent loss of your country's sovereignty. And prove this is a bad thing, right? That once you do sign these contracts and you make these negotiations, even if the negotiations might remove the tariffs, the conditions of you agreeing to those tariffs are also going to be a permanent harm to your country compared to maybe short-term harm as these tariffs might affect your country right now. The third thing is that it's likely to increase the global influence of the US significantly, making it more difficult to go against them in the long run. I also think to respond to Ops' claim that Trump is egotistical, so he won't back down. And the way you can do this is by flipping this, by letting them know that Trump knows that he is very egotistical, and therefore letting him know that this is ineffective will only result in him wanting to back down as well, but also that it's only effective when you result in him using it again and again and again because he likes to bully other nations. So if you let Trump know that using tariffs as a bargaining chip is a good tactic, he's going to want to use this again because he likes bullying other nations. And that's one thing that's quite dangerous. If you've proven the above two questions, I already think like it's more or less a win. But just in case, I think you can push something else, which is why even if this fails, Trump still, like even if Trump doesn't remove the tariffs, it's still all right. I think you can preempt this by saying that how most trading partners can trade with one another. So trading partners can still continue and kind of downplay how much you really need the US and some kind of mitigation here. But the second thing is that the US still needs you. They need your business. And therefore, even if they don't remove the tariffs, they will still find ways to engage in business through other ways. And therefore, it's not like a complete cutoff from the US market. And I think you can still say it's a good thing, right? That perceptually weakening the image of the United States, even if they don't take away the tariffs, is still a good thing. That means their ability to bully your country in the long run is also less, and this is in the interest of the entire world. And this is assuming that you're willing to consider that US domination isn't a good thing. You can say that the decrease in the good perception is probably a good thing as well. By now, I think you're probably already winning the debate, but to push the margins, I think you can, and to get like higher on the team tabs, I think you can prove as to why this is beneficial for smaller countries and run this extension maybe like second, which is that smaller countries have no choice but to listen. They don't have a lot of power or leverage. Why do we think they'll benefit of like larger trading countries refusing to negotiate? I think it's that if Trump reduces tariffs for large nations, there's a spillover to smaller nations as well, because it looks terrible on Trump if he only places tariffs on smaller countries and not on big countries. And it's also true that Trump doesn't want to admit defeat. So instead of just reducing the tariffs to bigger countries that supposedly beat him, he's likely to claim the tariffs have been successful and are no longer needed and revert them as a whole, including for smaller countries as well. But you can also make the argument that smaller countries can now join with larger countries to get better forms of negotiation, but also that like by refusing to negotiate, you also give increasing power to like the larger countries as well, which means that when you do help smaller countries, the amount of influence you have is also likely going to be quite larger. Moving on to opposition, I think setup is very similar to proposition, but you might want to add what your burdens are. So you need to prove that 1, the US will never back down, and 2, even if they do back down, the harm to the people in the process is way too high of a cost. So it's a straightforward push from opposition. So onto the 2 ideas. I think the first idea is that Trump will never back down. You can prove this through a bunch of ways. 1, he's egotistical, he's ego-driven, he doesn't want to look bad, there's immense amount of pressure for this policy to work. 2 is that this has been a huge Republican push and a political mandate, and he supported these tariffs from his party, and there's support for these tariffs from his supporters. So even if there's some backlash, the backlash is less likely to come from like his constituents, and therefore is less likely to care about this backlash as well. But 3 is that Trump doesn't have re-election incentives. So he doesn't care if the US gets hurt as long as his EU can still drive him. And Trump doesn't necessarily listen to his party either, which we've seen him do many times in the past. So even if there's some backlash from even his own party and his own Republicans, he's still less likely to like roll back these tariffs because he's not affected by like long-term re-election incentives. The second idea I think opposition should run is proving as to why not negotiating in general is a bad thing. And this is somewhat conceding to the claim that, maybe proposition will get the tariffs reduced in the long run. And what you can say here is there's going to be a massive time lag. That means from the time in which you refuse to negotiate, Trump is going to be egotistical. He's going to want to increase the amount of tariffs at first. And the backlash from the United States is going to be immense. And this is bad for a bunch of reasons, which means even if you are to get a change on proposition, it's going to take so much longer. And in this time, the harm on different markets is massive. The harm to huge exporters, for example, like the German car industry, the Canadian steel companies, and Japanese electronics is going to be massive. And I think you can impact this by saying that as a result of this, you have millions of jobs that depend on access to the US market, and governments simply cannot sacrifice these important actors on a principle. Even if you're able to get like Trump to lift the tariffs by not negotiating, if you can prove that the cost of human life and the quality of that life is way too high, then I think it's an easy push to say that, we care about these vulnerable individuals. And this is where the weighing becomes very important, because you need to prove then, by the short run has an extremely overwhelming importance. The small businesses need to rely on export sales, and high import prices is terrible because it means they either have to take the brunt themselves, which means they make less profit, or they have to sell at a higher price, which means they make less sales. And if you can also prove that the massive backlash from the United States outside of just economic zones, maybe it's going to be increasing like military tensions, or even economically going to say that they're going to like do other terrible things aside from tariffs, you can also make the strong argument that this is terrible for not only the major trading partners, but even the more vulnerable and smaller countries. So I think in general, these are like the two arguments you can run, what you can run on both sides. This is an exhaustive list. But I think it is quite useful to do like extensive research about the nuances of these deals and policies in the countries that are the most affected by this in order to like debate this motion properly. But yeah, I hope that was helpful.